Welcome everybody to the next Student Borrower Protection Center workshop on getting your debt canceled. This one is going to focus on borrowers with Federal Family Education Loan Program loans or FFELP loans or federally guaranteed loans. So if that's what you're here for, you are here in the right place. We're going to give it just another minute or two for folks to filter in, and we will get started at about 5 minutes past the top of the hour. Thanks. All right, well, it looks like we have everybody filtered in now. We are 3 minutes past the top of the hour, and I think we're going to get started. My name is Mike Pierce. I am with the Student Borrower Protection Center, and today we are going to talk about navigating debt relief for borrowers with older federal loans that were made by private lenders like Sallie Mae or by big banks and are still guaranteed by the federal government. I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague, Persis Yu, who's going to help do the Q&A and knows everything and anything about the circumstances that people with these loans find themselves in. So we are going to spend today talking about not just public service loan forgiveness, but certainly we'll spend some time there. We're also going to talk about the president's August announcement to cancel $10,000 or $20,000 worth of debt for nearly everybody that has a student loan, with some exceptions. And we're going to spend some time on those exceptions. And we're also going to talk about this other program called the IDR account adjustment. It's a way for people to try to get their debts canceled using income-driven repayment, something that has historically not worked very well, but the administration's trying to fix, and that remains open to folks who don't work in public service and do have FFELP loans and might otherwise be ineligible for other kinds of debt relief. So we are going to talk about a bunch of different, very complicated things. I'm going to try to go very slowly through each piece of policy here and walk through what exactly you need to know and how it works. But just know that we have a lot of frequently asked questions, short explainer videos, and tons of other resources on forgivemystudentdebt.org. That is forgivemystudentdebt.org. This website is a joint project of the Student Borrower Protection Center, the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, AFSCME, the International Brotherhood of Teachers, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the American Association of University Professors, the National Association of Social Workers. And we are working together to make sure that public service workers across the country can get their debts canceled, and also more broadly to make sure that every American that has a student loan and is eligible is able to get the debt relief they're entitled to under the law. So with that, I'm going to jump into the specifics here, but I am going to apologize in advance for the amount of jargon that I'm going to use today. So we do use a lot of acronyms here. The student loan system is complicated, and this might not speak to you. It might be the first time that you've looked at your student loans in a long time. It might be the first time you've heard any of these terms before. We're going to try to break it all down so it's simple, but it's never really simple. And if something seems complicated, please ask questions. We will try to save as much time as we can in the hour for Q&A. And also know that, again, we do have many, many, many frequently asked questions up on the web at forgivemystudentdebt.org. I will mention that website 5 more times in the next 35 minutes. That is forgivemystudentdebt.org. So as a starting place, why are you here? Back before 2010, going all the way back to the mid-60s, the way that most people got federal student loans was through a bank or a private lender like Sallie Mae. And the federal government guaranteed those loans. That program was called the Federal Family Education Loan Program, or FFELP. FFEL, sometimes referred to as the Federally Guaranteed Loan Program. And the way this worked for people that are older like me, you went to your school recommended a lender to you, and you got your loans to that lender, and the government backed up the loan, but you never actually took a loan out from the Department of Education. And there are still millions of people out there that have these loans. Some of them the government owns, some of them the government doesn't own now, and they're still held by private investors. And we'll talk about what that means and how to tell the difference in just a second. And that distinction is actually really important, because there are people that have these older loans who have the education department as the owner of those loans. These are people who got a loan from Sallie Mae or got a loan from Citibank, and the government bought those loans sometime over the course of the past 15 years. And that meant that your loans were paused when other federal student loan borrowers got their loans paused at the beginning of the pandemic. So we'll talk a few times about what that means and how to distinguish. But I do want to note that just because you went to Sallie Mae to get your loan doesn't mean that you're going to miss out on things necessarily. And so what we're going to try to do today, this is the first time we've ever convened this conversation, and so you should let us know how it goes. We're going to try to break this down and help you figure out what kind of loans you have, and then depending on what kind of loans you have, the different ways you can get your debt canceled. It's also really important to know that in 2010, Congress ended loans through this program. So if you took out a federal student loan, there's an exception that I'll talk about in a second, but if you took out a federal student loan, particularly a subsidized or an unsubsidized loan or something called a Stafford loan, after 2010, you know that was a loan made by the federal government. And that means that you don't have to worry about some of this next kind of more complicated piece of analysis to figure out whether you're in or out for some of these programs. So we are really talking to people that borrowed their loans back before 2010. The exception that I'll mention now and mention one more time at the end are Perkins loans. Perkins loans work a lot like these older FFELP loans, even though they were made all the way up through 2017. So you might have gotten a Perkins loan from your school. These are for relatively small amounts. The program was relatively small. There isn't a ton of this debt still out there. But I just wanted to flag that it's not a hard and fast rule, but generally, if you took out your loans after 2010, you probably are good to go here, and you don't need to spend your time figuring this out. We'll talk you through how, though. And I want to say one more time, the Biden administration has made some decisions recently to make debt relief harder for some of these borrowers. And you might see in the press coverage that this is, a relatively small number of people, 2% of all outstanding student loans. This is still millions of people. And I think if you're here, you're probably one of those millions of people. And before we get into the policy and how to get your debt canceled, we just wanted to acknowledge that you're not alone in this. And there are lots of folks that have these loans still that thought they were going to get debt relief through one program and they might not be able to anymore, but they still have other opportunities, and we are still fighting for you. And so I do want to just give some space for that before we actually get into the mechanics of how these programs work. So how do you tell whether you're one of these borrowers first, whether you have a loan through the FFELP program, and then next, how do you tell whether the government owns that loan or not? You can tell based on the name of the loan you have. Also, the word Stafford is usually a pretty good sign. The government stopped using the word Stafford to describe other loans that are not FFELP loans a long time ago. And so if you have a Stafford loan, you remember taking out a Stafford loan, that's probably a FFELP loan. You also can tell based on who your student loan company is. That's another kind of shortcut way to figure this out. Whether the government owns your loan. And again, the government owns some of these loans, and private companies also own some of these loans. So that all sounds like a jumbled mess. The important part from that is that there are ways to tell. And I'm now going to much more slowly kind of walk you through how you figure this out. If you go to studentaid.gov, which is the place where you filled out your financial aid forms back in the day, it is also the place where you would have enrolled in an income-driven repayment plan potentially. You can create a credential and log in. It only takes a few minutes. And at studentaid.gov, there is a thing called your student aid dashboard. And that doesn't just list the loans that you currently owe. It also lists every loan you've ever taken out that is guaranteed by the federal government made through one of these programs. So not just the loans the education department owns, but also loans that might be owned by somebody else, might be made by Sallie Mae or by a big bank, might be guaranteed by the federal government, might be in default and owned by what's called a guarantee agency. So we're going to talk about that in just a sec as well too. But when you get here, you will see on this person's dashboard, for example, there is a consolidation loan. These are direct loans. These are not FFELP loans, and they're described as direct consolidation, unsubsidized and subsidized loans. That's a good way to do a checkup. And there are zeros next to every other kind of loan. These are the loans that that person turned into a new consolidation loan. And they did everything right here. There was once a Perkins loan that they had taken out. They've turned that into a direct consolidation loan. And that puts them on track for a whole bunch of different kinds of debt relief programs. You can tell if you have one of these older loans, though, and you go into your dashboard and you expand the details, you can see your loan breakdown and what company is responsible for collecting monthly payments from you on those loans. So this is one of the ways you can tell whether you have one of these FFELP loans. And if you do, you can tell whether that is a loan the government owns or a loan somebody else owns. So if you see Department of Education anywhere on here as your loan servicer, that means you have one of these loans, but it's owned by the government. And again, I know this is complicated. I'm going to spend the rest of the next half hour talking about why it's important to make that distinction, even though it does seem really complicated. But the most important thing to know here, like the heuristic, the cheat for figuring this out really easily, is regardless of what kind of loan you have, if your loan was covered by the pause on loan payments going back to March of 2020, and you were not getting bills and you were not being charged interest, that means that the federal government owns your loan. So the government does own millions of people's FFELP loans, and those loans are treated differently than these older loans that might be owned by a private lender or made by a bank like Wells Fargo and still owned by investors. So that's another kind of easier way to tell. The thing you do if none of this makes sense, and I'm going to apologize in advance because what you get here is an enormously complicated text file that has all of your student aid data in it, but it is the administrative record that lets you do a final checkup. If nothing else I've said makes sense, you can go to your dashboard and you can download My Aid data. And what you get with My Aid data is a little bit of description, like a couple of lines of explanation about each of the loans that you've ever taken out that will include how much money you owe. And it will also mention whether you have federal family education loan or a FFELP loan, but it will say whether your loan has a guarantee agency or it has the Department of Education. So there are indicators kind of within this file about how you actually figure out what kind of loan you have. And that's the thing you do. That's the in case of emergency break glass. You can't make sense of this using your dashboard. None of the words work for you. So you can download your student aid file and you can actually check in the administrative record the government has whether or not the Department of Education owns your loan or somebody else owns your loan. We have more information on how to walk through that stuff step by step on forgivemystudentdebt.org. There is a video specifically focused on identifying your loan type here. So if this didn't make sense, if this seems complicated, just know that there's more information on forgivemystudentdebt.org. You can go there. There's also frequently asked questions. For the rest of this conversation, we're going to talk mostly to people that have these FFELP loans about what that means for you and what your opportunities are to get your debt canceled. We've now gotten through the material around how to figure out if you are one of those borrowers. And so I'm just going to speak directly to you as if you are from here on out. I will also note, though, that you can have a mixture. Lots of people have different kinds of loans. That screenshot we looked at a couple slides ago was somebody that had Perkins loans before, now only has direct loans. But prior to consolidating, they had a mix of different kinds of loans. And that's really, really normal. The government estimates about 2 million people fall into this category. They have older FFELP loans that might be owned by someone other than the education department. And they also have loans the government owns. And so you might have had some of your loans paused during the pandemic and other federal loans were not paused. That means you're one of those 2 million people. So we have gone through how, and we're going to assume that you are somebody who has a FFELP loan and needs to figure out how to make heads or tails of it. With that, we're going to talk about the 3 different opportunities to get your debt canceled that have been announced by the Biden administration over the course of the past 12 months. First, we're going to talk about big debt cancellation, $10,000 or $20,000 for nearly everybody. Then we're going to talk about public service loan forgiveness. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the mechanics of how to get your debt canceled under PSLF. We host webinars every week for public service workers. You may have found out about this webinar because you joined one of the other ones. You may have never joined one of our workshops for public service workers. We have them recorded online on our YouTube channel. They're also available in step-by-step short videos at forgivemystudentdebt.org. You can learn about the upcoming webinars we have if you go to forgivemystudentdebt.org. So I do want to say public service loan forgiveness is complicated. We have more to support you here than we're going to get to today. And then we're going to round out this conversation by talking about the income-driven repayment account adjustment, which is a way to get your debt canceled through income-driven repayment. And that is a slightly different process than public service loan forgiveness. It doesn't actually care about where you work, just that you're otherwise eligible for income-driven repayment. There's some things in common, some things that are different, and we'll walk through that too. So with that, Joe Biden promised to cancel your debt. What does it mean? In August, the president stood behind the podium in the White House briefing room and said that he is committed to canceling up to $10,000 for some people, up to $20,000 for most people. That's everybody that received a Pell Grant. And the borrowers who are eligible for this are everyone but high earners and only borrowers whose loans were owned by the federal government as of September 29th, 2022. And what that means is that it's going to leave out a bunch of FFELP borrowers whose loans are not owned by the government. That's part of why this analysis we just talked about, figuring out who owns your loan, is so important, because it doesn't mean that FFELP borrowers don't get their debt canceled. It just means that the specific loans that are not owned by the government as of last month are out. And any specific loan the government owns as of last month, whether that's a FFELP loan or a Perkins loan or a consolidation loan or a direct loan, these are all eligible to be canceled. And for those 2 million people that have both kinds of loans, you'll get the ones that are owned by the government canceled. You just won't be able to have your debts that are owned by other lenders canceled. There is an application for this. It's not automatic. The application is live at studentaid.gov. It went live as a beta a week ago, a little bit less than a week ago, last Friday night. It has been live in full force since the beginning of the week this week. We have heard that more than 8 million people have had their debts canceled already. I'm sorry, have filled out their application to have their debts canceled already. The government has said it won't actually start canceling these debts until next week at the earliest, but there's a line, and you should raise your hand and you should get in line. So there is no harm to filling out this application. Just know that if you have a loan that doesn't qualify because it's a FFELP loan that's still not owned by the government, you won't be able to benefit from this. Those are the new rules for this program. We're going to talk about some trade-offs and some challenges around that a couple times today. I should also note that for a lot of people, this doesn't seem like it's enough relief to really change their lives. For the 20 million people who are going to be debt-free because of this, this is an amazing opportunity. For folks that have higher debts, we're going to talk about public service loan forgiveness, and we're going to talk about income-driven repayment. And both of those programs offer the opportunity to have your debt canceled completely, no matter how much money you owe. And it may turn out that $10,000 or $20,000 worth of debt relief doesn't even touch the interest you owe on your loans, and that you are a borrower who is going to be much better served pursuing debt cancellation under income-driven repayment or under public service loan forgiveness. You generally don't have to choose. If you have a loan that the government owns as of September 29th, you can get both. Get a little bit of debt canceled now, get the rest of your debt canceled later. That's the best outcome for you. If you have one of these older loans, though, we're going to talk about how to get on track for these other programs, because this door is no longer open. We talked about who is eligible. The easiest thing, particularly for folks that have these loans that were made after 2010, anybody that has a loan made directly by the Department of Education is good to go. This includes current students. So the loans that were given out for this academic year don't count. but anything that was dispersed before June 30th of 2022 can be canceled here. So America's college students should be getting debt relief right now. We're working on college campuses, organizing with student groups, but if you know a student in your life that took out loans to go to school last year, have them fill out this application for debt relief. They can get their debt canceled. And again, I mentioned this, I'm going to keep repeating it. Some borrowers with these older federal loans made by banks and other private lenders like Sallie Mae are eligible to have their debt canceled. That includes every borrower with one of these loans that's in default on their loans. This is the first time in my lifetime the federal government has ever done anything big and bold and potentially transformational for borrowers in default. It is a huge deal. These are the borrowers who are often left behind in these conversations about how to cancel debt, how to help people make ends meet. So it is a really big win for folks that are in default to be able to just get out of debt completely. The average borrower in default has a balance that's $10,000 or less. It is a really good opportunity here to help people in default. And it doesn't matter what kind of loan you have. Any federal loan, whether that is a FFEL loan or a direct loan, if it is in default, it counts. Fill out your application, get your debt canceled. If it is not in default, however, the government has to own your loan. And one of the ways you can tell, we mentioned this before, I'm going to say it one more time, but I'm not going to walk through how. If you benefited from the pause on student loan payments, so you didn't have to pay bills, you didn't have interest charges going back to March of 2020, that means the government owns your loan. Whether it's a FFEL loan or a direct loan, the government owns your loan. And that means you should fill out this application for debt cancellation right away and get your debt canceled. I do want to have a warning here. Because of this new rule change that was put in place at the end of September, only borrowers who had consolidated their loans before September 29th can get on track to have their debts canceled under this new announcement. I mentioned before that there's about 2 million people that have both kinds of loans somebody else owns, loans the Department of Education owns. Those borrowers are still okay because the loans the education department owns will get canceled here if you fill out your application, as long as you don't mix them together. Consolidating your loans, and we're going to talk about consolidating your loans and how to consolidate in just a moment, is the only way you can take yourself out of the running if you have these loans that the government owns. You mix them together and one bad apple spoils the bunch. Your older commercial FFEL or Perkins loans that don't count will make your new direct consolidation loan ineligible. This is super technical. We're going to come back to it in just a second, but I just wanted to note that this does not affect your eligibility for public service loan forgiveness or income-driven repayment, and that it might still make sense for you to not get in line at all to get $10,000 or $20,000 worth of debt relief in pursuit of getting all of your debt canceled right now. So we're going to talk about how you do that now. We're going to talk about public service loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment. Public service loan forgiveness. I'm going to repeat what I said a few minutes ago. We have so much material out there on forgivemystudentdebt.org to help people make heads or tails of the public service loan forgiveness program. We are not going to do a full public service loan forgiveness workshop right now, but we are going to talk about how this works at a very high level. Under the law, which was passed in 2007, if you had a direct loan, you enrolled in the right kind of repayment plan, which is income-driven repayment, you work full-time for a public service employer, and you do all of that every month for 120 months, the government promised to cancel your debt. If you're here, you might know that that didn't work. And that actually, when the first borrowers spent 10 years in repayment, so this is 2017, 10 years later, and they raised their hands and said, hey, federal government, I've kept my end of the bargain. I've worked for 10 years in public service. It's time for you to cancel my debt. 99 out of every 100 were told to take a walk. And Washington, D.C. freaked out and spent years trying to figure out how to make this thing work. And 4 years later, by the time Joe Biden came into office, 98 out of every 100 public service workers who raised their hand and said, I did my part, cancel my debt, were still being told no. So President Biden ran on a promise to fix this mess, and he kept his word. In October of last year, the White House announced that there would be this thing called a time-limited waiver of public service loan forgiveness requirements, which is a mouthful. That is a program that only government could name. But what it means is that all of those people out there who did raise their hand and say, I kept up my end of the bargain, I worked in public service for a decade, I made payments on my loans, cancel my debt, are starting to get their debts canceled now. And I'll talk about how and why, but I do want to note that's 200,000 public service workers across the country who are now debt-free. That is more than 20 times the amount of debt relief that had been delivered through this program in the 14 years before. More than 2 million public service workers, in addition to that, 200,000, got some credit towards public service loan forgiveness because of this new program. And time is running out. So I'm going to talk about that too, the deadline, in just a second. But I want to note as a starting place, these requirements that knocked so many people off track, the reason the government said no when people raised their hands, they're being waived right now. So it doesn't matter what kind of loan you have. It doesn't matter what kind of payment plan you have. As long as you're making payments and you're enrolled in some payment plan, you can get on track to get your debt canceled. And it's working for folks. You do still have to be working full-time in public service to get credit for periods of public service. But if you lost your job during the pandemic or you had a reduction in hours, you can still raise your hand and apply for debt relief. That was not true under the law. You had to be working in public service at the time your loan was canceled. But because of the pandemic, recognizing that there are hundreds of thousands of fewer teachers in America, the government is saying we'll waive that requirement, but only until the end of October. It's also not completely automatic, particularly for folks that are FFEL borrowers, the people that are here today to have this conversation. So if you're working in public service, this is a place where it doesn't matter whether you're paying a loan that was paused or not. If you have anything other than a direct loan, you have to turn it into a direct loan. So everybody with a FFELP loan has to consolidate to benefit from public service loan forgiveness. Everybody with a Perkins loan has to consolidate to benefit from public service loan forgiveness. I know this is a little bit confusing because I just said something different for the other program. But for public service loan forgiveness to be able to get on track, you have to consolidate. So you are at risk of missing out because the window to consolidate closes at the end of this month. I'll talk about how in just a moment. And then also note that you do have to still be working in public service to get credit towards public service loan forgiveness. And there's a process for certifying that service. There's lots of information, including short instructional videos and frequently asked questions about how to certify your service, available on forgivemystudentdebt.org. I will note that ACT means something very specific here. You have to raise your hand and tell the government that you want to benefit from this waiver. You don't have to finish the process. Anybody that starts right now is not going to get their debt canceled by the end of the month. That's okay. Don't worry about it. You just have to do some of the stuff that shows you want to get on track. That includes starting the process of certifying your service. If you can do it, have your employer sign your certification form and submit it. Again, there's more information on forgivemystudentdebt.org about what that means and how you do it. Also, consolidating your loans, which we're just about to talk about. That's another way you can raise your hand. There's a box you can check on the form. That's how you can raise your hand and tell people that you want to get the benefit of the public service loan forgiveness waiver. So I will say the deadline one more time. That is October 31st. That is in just a bit more than a week. On Halloween, you have to have done something to tell the government you want to benefit from this, or you are going to miss out. What are the really important things you need to know to make sure that you're checking the right boxes to get on track between now and Halloween? You have to figure out if your employer is a qualified public service employer. And again, there's information on forgivemystudentdebt.org about how you do that. You have to figure out what kind of loans you have. And we already covered that today. But again, there's short videos on forgivemystudentdebt.org about how you figure that out. And then you have to figure out whether you've told the government that you've actually worked in public service. I'm repeating the high notes here. I just said a few of these things a couple slides ago. I'm going to say them again right now. To figure out if you have a qualified employer, you can go to studentaid.gov and use this thing called the PSLF help tool. If your employer is not listed, never fear. There's lots of public service organizations that aren't. You likely still can qualify. And again, how to make this work, how to work through those steps, we have videos on forgivemystudentdebt.org. Do the thing we already talked about. Make sure that you have a direct loan to be able to get on track for public service loan forgiveness. If you are here at the FFEL webinar, it means you probably don't, and you're going to have to consolidate. I'll walk you through how to do that in just a moment. But if you have a direct loan and you only have a direct loan, whether or not that's a consolidation loan, you have checked this box, you are on track for PSLF, and you just have to tell the government how much public service work you've completed. There's a form for that, because of course there's a form for that. You have to fill it out. You can actually populate part of it online and then have your employer sign it and submit it. All you have to do as a part of this process to have been considered raising your hand. We know there are big employers, the University of California, for example, that's just not able to turn around forms for people fast enough to hit the deadline. As long as you have selected your employer on the education department's website and generated the form to submit to your HR, that's enough to raise your hand. The government considers you in line. Starting the consolidation process is another way the government considers you in line. Having the government look up your employer if it's one that's not matched in their database, that's another way to make sure that you've raised your hand and you've gotten yourself in line. So I will just note that there's lots of ways to get in line. We recommend folks do as many of these things as you possibly can, because it's complicated and the government has a bad track record here, and the government's contractors have an even worse track record here. So you should do as many of these things as you can. Start the consolidation process, start the process, or finish it if you can, of certifying your service, start the process of matching your employer, do all the things you can do to show the government that you want to get in line for public service loan forgiveness. I know I covered this very, very quickly. There is a longer version of this available at the workshops that we host regularly. Check out the list of those on forgivemystudentdebt.org. We will do this slowly and define all the terms and show you screenshots of what the website looks like. There's also short instructional videos you can just grab and go. And please do ask questions here, but we are going to try to keep the Q&A today focused on what FFEL borrowers need to know, and we're going to push off the PSLF questions to the next workshop. So with that, I want to turn the page on public service loan forgiveness and talk about a different program that we haven't spent a lot of time on these workshops talking about in the past, and that isn't very well understood by borrowers, but is potentially a lifeline for people with FFEL loans. That's the income-driven repayment account adjustment, which again is a mouthful. But what that means is that you have another path to debt relief. This is particularly true for borrowers with older loans. We estimate that about 4.4 million people have loans that are 20 years old or older and might be able to get their debts canceled either right away or very, very soon if you're able to take a couple of extra steps here. So unlike public service loan forgiveness, which promises to cancel your debt after 10 years, every single person with a student loan has an opportunity to enroll in some version of income-driven repayment. And those borrowers can get their debts canceled in either 20 or 25 years, regardless of whether or not they work in public service. It doesn't matter what your job is, just as long as you've enrolled in the program. And this is particularly important for low-income folks and unemployed folks, because your payment can be as low as $0 a month under income-driven repayment. And obviously, it doesn't matter where you work. You could be out of work and still benefit from this. And so coming on the tail end of this pandemic, where lots of folks have lost jobs or had reductions of income, figuring out how to make income-driven repayment work for you is a really big deal. And I mentioned before that when the public service loan forgiveness program first made debt cancellation available under the Trump administration, 99 out of every 100 public service workers applied for debt relief, said, I did my part, now cancel my debt. And the government said no. It is much, much worse for people in income-driven repayment. Some research that my colleague Persis did, who's here today published a bit more than a year ago, found that only 32 student loan borrowers in all of America had ever had their debts canceled under income-driven repayment. I think that number is now up to between 125 and 130 people out of 4.4 million who have decades-old debts. Part of the reason that there is now this opportunity that looks a lot like the PSLF waiver, but for income-driven repayment, is because the program was basically just a lie. People were promised a way out of debt and they weren't given it. And so now the Biden administration has come behind all of these other efforts and said, here's a way forward for people with decades-old debt. So what does that mean exactly? You have this alphabet soup of income-driven repayment plans. I'm not going to walk through the differences between all of them. Just know that there's more information on studentaid.gov about this. But everybody has something that they're technically eligible for. You might have to go through some extra hoops to get on track, but this is everybody. And depending on the program that you're enrolled in, there's an end date under the deal here. If you make payments for 10 years, you get PSLF. If you make payments for 20 years or 25 years, you get your debt canceled this way. This is supposed to be a way out. What the IDR account adjustment does, what the administration announced in April of last year, is that they're not going to care whether you actually manage to figure out how to get yourself enrolled in one of those alphabet soup of income-driven repayment plans. They're going to give everyone credit towards 20 or 25-year debt cancellation. And for most people, it's 20 years. Regardless of what kind of loans you took out, regardless of what kind of payment plan you used to be enrolled in before the pandemic, there are going to be ways for you to potentially get refunds if you paid more than you needed to for 20 years or 25 years. If you kept paying after you hit that point, any extra payments will be refunded to you as long as the government owns your loans. And most importantly here, for folks that have been using forbearance or deferment, this is finally a way out for a lot of people. We know that big student loan companies like Navient routinely told people to enroll in forbearance instead of enrolling in income-driven repayment. And this account adjustment is supposed to make people whole if they've been pushed into a forbearance, told to not make payments at all, instead of enrolled in an income-driven repayment plan. And if you've used forbearance for more than 12 months in a row, or 36 months over the life of your loan, which is super, super common, you're going to get credit towards debt cancellation, both for PSLF and for income-driven repayment, under this IDR account adjustment. Unlike public service loan forgiveness, there is not a hard deadline here. This is a program that exists right now. It is working. It will be online and working through the end of the year and beyond. The government has not said when they're going to end it. They just said that they're going to start giving people account credit sometime late in the year this year or early in the year next year. Also note that for people that have forbearance but haven't used a ton of it, there is also potentially a way for you to raise your hand and ask for help from the Department of Education. There's going to be more information released about how that works later on this year. The last thing I will say for the FFELP borrowers is that to benefit from this, you must consolidate. And this is the same thing that you need to do to make sure, to figure out whether you're on track for debt cancellation, the first debt cancellation we talked about. This isn't public service loan forgiveness. You don't have to make sure you have a direct loan, but you do have to make sure the government owns your loan. So if you have one of those older commercial FFEL loans, you're going to want to turn that older commercial FFEL loan into a new direct loan. And I'm going to offer a word of warning about consolidation in just a second, and then we're going to do some Q&A. So consolidating your loans. You're here because you're a FFEL borrower. You want to take advantage of one of the programs that I mentioned earlier today. I am sorry that the door is already closed on broad debt cancellation for you, that consolidating your loan right now is not going to get you $20,000 or $10,000 for the debt cancellation, but it could get you public service loan forgiveness. It could get you debt cancellation under income-driven repayment, especially if you're an older borrower. So just know that to do this, you need to go to studentaid.gov. And consolidating it works kind of like refinancing a house. You take out a new loan from the Department of Education, and they pay off your old loan. So they pay back Sally Mae or whoever owns your old loan. And you get a new direct loan with new terms and is eligible for all these new rights and benefits. And you do that by filling out an online application that's super simple. Go to studentaid.gov. You'll see when you log in, there's some information about public service loan forgiveness on here too. And you go through the process of consolidating your loans, which should only take about 15 or 20 minutes. If you're pursuing public service loan forgiveness, there's a box you can check to tell the government you want to pursue public service loan forgiveness. That's one of the ways you raise your hand to get on track. You also get to pick your student loan company. I should also note that consolidating does not lower your interest rate. I'll say it again, consolidating does not lower your interest rate. All you're doing is mushing all of your loans together, and you get a new interest rate that's the average of all the loans on your account. You can pick which loans are included in your consolidation. I'll talk about why that's important in just a moment. Again, this is the what we've been calling the bad apple problem for those 2 million people that have both loans that are FFELP loans owned by someone else and other loans that are owned by the Department of Education. This is the point where you could accidentally mix them all together and lose eligibility for $10,000 or $20,000 worth of debt relief for the loans the government owns. You may want to do that with eyes wide open, and we'll talk about that in a sec too, because there's reasons public service workers especially might want to do that, but this is the most complicated part of the process here. And so I apologize that that was very confusing. I know it was. We are doing our best to explain this as clearly as we can here, but just be aware that you have to consolidate your FFEL loans into new direct loans to get on track for public service loan forgiveness, to get on track for income-driven repayment, adjustment, debt cancellation. You do not have the ability to consolidate those loans to get $10,000 or $20,000 for the debt relief. That door is closed. When you do this consolidation, you also have a chance to pick a payment plan. And if you are consolidating to pursue PSLF or to pursue income-driven repayment debt relief, you should pick an income-driven repayment plan here. That doesn't mean you're going to have to make payments right away. The payments for these loans are paused until the end of the year, and it's going to take some amount of time after that before anybody actually gets bills and has to pay them. You're not opting into repayment by picking a payment plan here. You're just telling the government what payment plan you want to start on if the student loan system starts up again. This is the most complicated part, but it's really good news for folks that are eligible. So I mentioned before that there are 2 million people that have both kinds of loans, loans the government owns and loans that are owned by a private creditor. And if you mix them, you're going to lose out on the ability to get your debt canceled $10,000 or $20,000 worth through this announcement the president made back in August. But what you get in exchange for that, for some people, is the ability to get the whole thing wiped out. This is a hack that makes the public service loan forgiveness waiver work so much better for a very specific kind of borrower with older loans. The reason this is true is because once you mix those loans together, if you're a public service worker, the government's going to look at the date you started making payments on the oldest loan and give all of your loans credit towards debt cancellation based on whatever you did for that oldest loan. So if I'm a borrower who took out some loans from undergrad, made a few years of payments, went back to grad school, worked after grad school for another few years, and I hit 10 years of service on those undergrad loans, mixing them all together will give you 10 years of service on your grad loans too, and can make you completely debt-free as long as you have 10 years of service in total, or can get you much closer to debt relief for all of your loans because you'll get credit on your oldest loan. Getting credit on your oldest loan will make you lose out on debt cancellation for your loans that the government owns if you're mixing these kinds of loans together. So just be warned, there are risks here, but there is a trick here that can make some public service workers debt-free really fast. This is the same slide that we had up before. I'm just going to repeat what I've said 4 times now. Mixing these loans together does not affect your eligibility for PSLF or for income-driven repayment. And you might want to mix them together because it helps you speed up the time to be debt-free. But it does take you out of the running for $10,000 or $20,000 worth of debt relief if you have loans that the government owns. So again, for those 2 million people that have both kinds of loans, mixing them together makes you miss out on $10,000 or $20,000 worth of debt cancellation, but it also might speed up the time to get you debt-free. You need to think about a couple different things when making that decision. The easiest way to think about this, I think, is how much debt do you have and how long have you been working in public service, or how long have you been in repayment on a student loan? So if you are really close to 10 years of public service work or 20 years of repayment on your oldest student loan, it might turn out that mixing all of those loans together is a great opportunity for you. Everyone's going to have to make that decision on their own. Again, we are not providing legal advice here. We are not your financial advisor. We are just sharing the best information that we have available right now. And this is the hardest, highest stakes decision that borrowers will have to make. Again, that's only 2 million out of the roughly 42 million people that are going to be eligible for one of these programs. It's not everybody, but for those 2 million people that have to make this decision, it's a hard one. And the difference can be $10, $20, $60, $100,000 to you. if you make the right decision now versus the wrong decision. So we just wanted to flag that the set of choices is out there. We know it is very complicated, and everyone should consider the downsides here before you make a choice. There are also some other downsides potentially to consolidating. Your interest rate will go up very slightly because there's some rounding. There's also potentially some challenges for folks that are in defaults. Not everybody's eligible for consolidation. So just know that the education department has more information about the risks of consolidation. But for most borrowers, the benefits of PSLF and IDR will outweigh the downsides. And for borrowers that are going to potentially miss out on debt cancellation to pursue PSLF, that's an individual decision. You are making a bit of a bet about whether being debt-free soon or immediately is more important to you than getting some amount of immediate debt relief. We are now basically done with our material here. We're going to have about 15 minutes for questions. I do want to flag a couple things, though. You might get targeted by scams. Scams abound. There's scams everywhere. The promise of hundreds of billions of dollars of debt relief is just too good to pass up for scammers. And if the education department servicers were doing better jobs here, if you could actually pick up the phone and call the people that are supposed to help you with your student loans, there probably wouldn't be so many scams. But we're in this world where the government has hired companies that are really terrible at their jobs to try to give you advice, and that has spawned scams all across the country. So just be careful. Know that no reputable company is ever going to cold call you and ask you for cash to cancel your debt. That is just not how honest businesses work. There are wonderful student loan lawyers out there that charge for clients that have really complicated situations. There are amazing nonprofit counselors that provide advice to folks that also might charge a fee for that advice. That's not who I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the unknown number that calls your cell phone and says, for $50, I will get your debt canceled for you. Those are scams. Do not give those people your financial information. And if you experience issues, whether that's with a student loan company or this whole process or one of these scams, file a complaint. You can do that at consumerfinance.gov. That's the regulator for the student loan industry. You can file a complaint directly with the Department of Education at studentaid.gov/complaint. With that, I am going to welcome my wonderful colleague Persis to hop on here with me. And we are going to try to answer as many questions as we can in the next 11 minutes. But we also have a lot of frequently asked questions on forgivemystudentdebt.org. We're going to keep adding them. So just know that if we don't get to your questions today, there will be other opportunities to get more information. And we're going to be doing another one of these webinars on November 3rd. We're going to be doing another webinar for FFELP borrowers. So with that, want to do some questions?
So yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. Persis here with the Student Borrower Protection Center. One of the questions that was asked a lot, and so just to get this off the top, this webinar will be available afterwards. This is being recorded and you will get a link in your emails at the conclusion of this. So one question that is coming up a lot, there's a lot of confusion around kind of this bad apple problem and what happened on September 29th. So can you talk a little bit more about kind of what happens to people who mixed their loans before September 29th and people who mix their loans after September 29th?
So September 29th is the key date here. If you mixed your loans before September 29th, you don't need to worry about that. The government cares about what their loan portfolio looks like what loans the government owned as of September 29th. And so if you did these steps before, the government thinks you're in, it is one of their loans. Your consolidation doesn't need to be processed by September 29th. You just have to have submitted it by September 29th. And that's the point where the government is going to keep its promise and keep the door open for all of these different programs for you. If you consolidate your loan after September 29th, so you start this process today because we've talked about it, or you did it a couple of weeks ago when you heard this news, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get your debt canceled for those older loans. And if you combine your older loans with the loans the government owns, you've made that whole new direct consolidation loan ineligible for $10,000 or $20,000 worth of debt relief. But you have still opened the door to be able to get your loans canceled through public service loan forgiveness or through income-driven repayment.
The next question that's come up a fair amount here is there any hope for FFELP borrowers with commercially held FFELP loans?
Yes, of course. And I think that it's really frustrating that we're in this place where this particular program is closed off to those borrowers. The administration has said they're trying to come up with a third way to be able to deliver debt relief to those folks that doesn't involve consolidating your loans. We are pushing really hard at the Student Borrower Protection Center to open up a door for folks to get their debt canceled through a different channel that's not consolidation. And as soon as we know more, we will share that with you. We have everyone's email addresses who's registered tonight. We are continuing to push as advocates to be able to open up debt relief for those borrowers. There is also a lawsuit in federal court that's trying to provide for a path for debt relief for those borrowers. So there's a lawsuit route and a policy route and potentially other changes on the pipeline. And I will say one more time, public service loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment debt cancellation is still open for those folks. The only door that closed is $10,000 or $20,000 for the debt relief.
And so one of the criteria that you mentioned for being eligible for cancellation is borrowers with defaulted loans. One of the questions that a number of folks had is, what does it mean to default? I think some folks then naturally think, should I be defaulting on my loans? But I think, do you want to talk about what it means to be in default?
Yeah, and you can correct me if I get this wrong because you're the expert. But if you have not made payments on your loan, practically speaking, that's a year without making payments. Before the pandemic, the law says 270 days or 9 months, but for most people, it's a full year without having made a payment. Your loan goes into default and your student loan company changes. So your loan gets placed with a company called a guarantee agency. The big guarantee agencies are companies called ECMC or Ascendium or Trellis. That's most of the outstanding FFEL loans that are in defaults. Or if you have a loan the government owns, it will go to the default resolution group, might be the company that sends you a mailer or tries to call you. When I say not making payments for a year, I don't mean the payment pause. So this is how I would have explained this to you in 2019. Since March of 2020, lots and lots of people haven't had payments due at all. You obviously have not defaulted in on your loans if you had your payments paused. But for people that didn't make payments when they were due, particularly back before the pandemic, and your loan got placed with another company because you defaulted, the change of company is a good signal that your loan is now in default. Your whole balance comes due. You get contacted by debt collectors. It will appear on your credit report as a defaulted loan. There's a bunch of different ways you can tell, but also when you go to studentaid.gov and look at your dashboard, it will note your defaulted loans when you look at the summary of your loans. How did I do?
I think that's right. I think it's important. I think really the time frame is important for folks to think about. Obviously, we do not provide legal advice and will not advise you to default on your loans or to not default, but there are consequences and it takes a long time. So that's something to build in. There's been a lot of discussions about refunds. Can you talk about the department's refund policy in relation to cancellation and then somewhat what this means for FFEL borrowers with commercially held FFEL in particular?
Yeah, so there's good news and bad news here. The good news is that everybody that had a loan that was covered by the payment pause has had a right to get any payments made refunded going all the way back to March of 2020. There's been a little bit of change around these sets of rules as it relates to borrowers who've refinanced their loans with a private company. There was a window where you could have rolled back that refinance. It seems like that might be closed, but basically everyone else, it's about 9 million people who made payments during the pandemic on loans that were paused. You have a right to get that money back. And if you've paid your loan down below $20,000 or below $10,000, you can get a refund for those payments to maximize the amount of debt cancellation you get when Joe Biden goes and cancels student debt. For the borrowers who are stuck with commercial FFEL loans, though, you do not have a right to a refund. And I know I see in the chat here folks saying that they try to get a refund from Navient. That's a good example of a lender that owns one of these older FFEL loans who isn't giving out refunds, and they don't have a legal obligation to do so. Unfortunately, it's another place where having not consolidated a year or two ago means that you're going to miss out on another piece of protections here. It's why we're fighting for parity for borrowers with these loans to make sure that they do get all of these rights. But as of today, you don't have a right to a refund for these commercial FFEL loans, and your refunds on other loans only go back as far as the payment pause goes. So you can't get refunded payments for loans that you paid off before March of 2020.
So I'm just mindful that we only have 4 minutes left. So I apologize, folks, for the questions that we're not going to be able to get to because we have a ton of them. Please go to forgivemystudentdebt.org for more answers. I think there's a lot of confusion still about the IDR account adjustment and folks who have been making payments for a long period of time. A number of folks want to know whether or not they will lose the count of the payments, or whether they will no longer get the count of those payments made before they consolidate.
Do not worry. So part of the magic of the account adjustment is that if you consolidate now, you will get credit for the period of time you spent making payments on those loans before you consolidated, whether or not that was an income-driven repayment. So yes, you do keep those months of payments. If you actually manage to get enrolled in IDR and make IDR payment, you keep them. But even if you didn't, even if you were just making payments on your loans under an extended payment plan or a standard payment plan or a graduated payment plan, those months count too. So the government is basically measuring the time you were making payments on your loans, not what payment plan you were enrolled in. And because they're doing that, starting from the day you consolidate, working backwards, everyone gets credit regardless of what payment plan. So you keep your credit if you have it, you get new credit if you don't.
But you need to act fast. We don't have a solid deadline for the IDR account adjustment, but at some point it will end and we don't yet know what that is. So the sooner the better. And how do you apply for income during payment?
You want to take that one?
Sure. So this is another place where you're going to want to go to studentaid.gov. There is a place on there where you can manage repayment and go down to apply for income during payment. You will have to, again, consolidate before in order to access the more generous plans. Some folks have also asked about how do you get the 20 or 25 years, like which plan it is. And that basically boils down to which plan do you qualify for. Most folks with FFELP loans will probably, the best plan will be repay. For many people, you'll still want to do more research about that. But for those folks, if you have only undergraduate loans, 20 years of payments count, will count towards forgiveness. If you have graduate loans, that period is 25 years. And so the last question that I think we'll go to is, do you have to have met the 10 years or the 20 or 25 years in order to try to apply for the PSLF waiver, PSLF in general, or the IDR account adjustment?
That is a great question. So I mentioned some stats really far up at the top of this presentation about who's benefited so far. The answer is no, you absolutely do not need to be across the finish line to be able to benefit here. 200,000 public service workers are now debt-free because of the waiver, but another 2 million got extra credit towards public service loan forgiveness. So for everybody who's debt-free, there's 10 more people who are further along on their path to being out of debt. The same is true for the income-driven repayment adjustment. Everyone is eligible. Get as much credit as you're eligible for, but you have to act fast.
All right, I think that's all the time that we have.
All right, well, thank you, Persis. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Again, I will say forgivemystudentdebt.org. There is lots of information there. We're going to be hosting another one of these webinars for FFELP borrowers on November 3rd. We're going to be hosting public service workshops between now and the end of the month. We're going to start hosting debt cancellation workshops just focused on some of these other programs starting in November. So check out forgivemystudentdebt.org for more information. And thank you all again for joining us today.